Getting inside the new Kia Soul. You may have seen the launch video for this. If you haven't checked that out, I'll put the link. This is the GT line, which has the turbocharger and the dual clutch transmission. I was in the X line, which is trying to make it look like a CUV, more rugged, but all of them are front wheel drive cars. And as you go up in the trim level like this, you get more performance, you get more gadgets, you get more tech. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. The big thing here is the illuminated door panels that react with your music. It's called the sound mood lamp, and you change it in the infotainment. Now the cool part is the grille surrounds for the speakers and the door light up. The floorboard will light up in certain conditions, and it's reactive to bass in the music. But that's also paired with the Harman Kardon audio system, which it tests not so good, and it's just audibly bad. It's tuned to be extremely bass heavy. There's at no point can you get this to sound neutral. I tried Android Auto, I tried Bluetooth, it's just always boomy. And that's a bad thing because you can never get rid of just that effect of the bass. Even when you turn down the bass, it just doesn't sound good. But if you like to play your music loud, and that's the side effect, it plays better loud than it does quiet. So I think that's part of it. If you're in that group that you like louder music, you'll like the audio system. When you move up the trim, you also get, up to this higher trim level, you also get something called piano gloss black plastic all over everything. And I'm gonna tell you that I've been in the X line, which replaces all that with matte plastic. I would have to go down to the lower trim level because it looks absolutely horrible in here. The steering wheel's covered with it, the vents, the entire center surround around the infotainment screen, the center console, it's all scratched up, it looks horrible, and it's so glossy. It's just a bad choice. The other part is they start to do little other things here like the HUD. Instead of projecting the heads-up display on the windshield like a lot of cars, they have this plexiglass thing that pops up out of the gauge cluster. Now, luckily, you can turn it off and then it goes back down and you never are distracted by it. One of the negative parts is it's a lot more reflective, it's not as easy to see, and it's kind of line of sight. It's just looks cheap. But it lowers the dashboard height. Traditional HUDs that project on the glass raise up the dash. This doesn't have it, but again, you can choose to raise or lower it if you want, which is a good thing that they did that. In the upper trim level, you get individual HVAC control, dual zone. It's all controlled separately from the infotainment, which is great. You don't have to use the touchscreen for that. It has a wireless charger, which again, like most modern wireless chargers, is slow wireless charging. It is horrendously slow. You'll be lucky to get 10% on a modern smartphone in like 25 minutes. And, you know, again, it's one of those things, I wouldn't pay extra for a lot of this tech that is just kind of there just to be there for the cool factor, and it's not all that usable. But what I will say is this upgraded infotainment, specifically the screen, is one of the best. I'm literally best in the class, or up to something like Audi and BMW and the recent Porsche I was in. This screen is that good. Contrast levels are great, black levels are good, and you can even leave it on at night. It's not searing. So they did a great job with the technology implementation here. It's quick, it's easy to use, everything works. So that's a high point if you focus on that. Really everything else, you get heated seats, heating steering wheel in the GT trim, and the seats are cloth, but they are super comfortable. They work really well. The back seat room is pretty good. And this is one of the largest cargo capacities in its class. It bests most CUVs, and that's because you have this bread box design. They're not trying to make it the car/SUV thing, so you do get more interior room, and you can see out of it. It has one of the best visibilities out of most vehicles in its class. But again, I would say this is best bought at the lower trim, getting rid of a lot of these gimmicks that just cost money and don't work. And that's kind of the main thing to talk about. But let's get this on the lift and see what the underbody looks like. Underneath the Kia Soul. Now, whether you get the GT line or the X line or whatever trim you get, it's going to look very similar here with the exception of the EV. But I'll get into that in a minute. The front half of this car looks like an entry-level vehicle, and that's because it is. This is built on one of their more eco-friendly or budget-friendly platforms, which means it can be shared with multiple vehicles. It's strut front, everything is steel, everything is very easily accessible in this car, and that's a huge thing if you're gonna keep a car for a long time. This is a vehicle for me that you're gonna take, you're gonna buy, or you're gonna buy it used, and you're gonna do a lot of the simple stuff yourself, like oil changes. They've cut out holes here so you can get to the oil filter, to the drain plug simply. You can get at everything in the suspension. I mean, this is a very simple looking vehicle on the underneath, and it shines through the rest of the car. They do use paneling where they need to reduce road noise, NVH. They do not carpet the wheel wells on this car. It's just a plastic material. But overall, this is right in line with what you're gonna see in a car in the $20,000 price range. Now, let's take a look at the back and see what the rear end has to offer. Nothing back here particularly gets my blood pumping, but this has a torsion beam rear end. The rear suspension is this gigantic beam that connects both sides of the suspension. This is used more than often because it's simple, it's easy to manufacture and assemble, and it saves money for the end user. The difference between this and a more complicated multi-link in the manufacturing process is around $400 for Hyundai or Kia per vehicle. So you can imagine what that's like if they make hundreds of thousands of these. It also saves a ton of money in development cost, in terms of engineering development cost. It's not just the manufacturing part, but to do it right takes a lot of engineering hours, and vehicles like this, from my understanding from talking to Kia reps and Hyundai reps, is the customer base is more value focused. They want a cheaper vehicle with more tech, and that's why you strip away independent rear. Now the only difference here is on the EV version of this, it does get a multi-link rear, and that's partly because of weight and packaging. Now the big thing is you don't have an all-wheel drive Soul, and that's where the biggest difference is, and I think that would be one thing that might transform this vehicle specifically with the turbo that might make it better, but we'll get into all that in the drive. But again, it's all basic back here. You have a manual parking brake, so there's no electronic parking brake, so even brake jobs will be more simple and cost-effective in the long run. But let's take this out on the road and see how it drives. Setting off in the Kia Soul GT line. This is the Turbo. So, what happens when you combine a turbocharged 1.6 liter and a 7-speed dual clutch automatic? What you would think is it would be something extraordinary, and the engine and transmission are pretty good. But when you throw it into the Kia Soul, something that wasn't properly designed or ever designed for this type of horsepower or torque, it feels like, I'm going to tell you how it feels. It feels like somebody did an engine swap on some like 90s car that was never designed for it, and all the engineering didn't go into it. And the way that it makes you feel is, unless you are going perfectly straight and you nail it kind of like in second gear, like right now, all right, it feels pretty good. It feels quick. You still feel tugging at the steering wheel. You feel the torque steer pulling it left and right. It's not horrible, but it's pretty annoying. But when you come to a stop and you try to nail this going straight, even in perfectly dry conditions, there's wheel spin, the traction stability control go into hyperactive mode, and it is such a distracting, annoying experience. And the worst part is when you turn the wheel left or right, like if you have to merge or turn onto a left or right road and you have to punch it, like I'm in a rural area, you constantly have to merge into these 55, 65 mile an hour zones. Oh my God, is it a total disaster. And this is where, you know, from a product marketing or engineering standpoint, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And while I think this would be a very good transmission and engine combo on a car that probably could use it better, where you design the suspension around it more, when you can afford to put a limited slip differential and not have to heavily lean on electronics to control it, it would be a much better driving experience. So the point is here, basically, the naturally aspirated version with the CVT, that makes a hell of a lot more sense in this car. Namely, when you consider to get to this trim level, you're bumping this up to like $26,000 or $27,000 MSRP. And there's no way that I could recommend it for how unsorted it is, despite it being very quick. If you happen to get traction in the right conditions or you have the right tires, it is really quick for what this is because it doesn't weigh much. But, you know, there's more to it than straight line speed. You're cornering in throttle, turning and throttling. It's just, ugh. It's one of the things that I can't stand. It's one of the few cars where I honestly feel like the more base trims are better. Now, once we start getting into some of the more, the nuances of the Kia Soul, and I said this during the launch, if you drove the old Kia Soul, the previous generation, back to back with this, you'd be blown away at how much more refined this is. It's way more quiet. The ride quality is way better. The comfort's better. The ergonomics, basically everything works so much better in here than it did in the previous generation. And it doesn't feel like it's built on as much of a budget. So when you spend a little bit more time in it and you kind of remove that comparison, like, okay, compared to the previous Soul, and you start comparing it to like the Mazda 3 hatch or the CX-30s or the Honda Civics or the Corollas, that's when you start to notice more where the refinement is where the refinement's lacking. Things like the torque steer, things like there's a lot of NVH, there's a ton of NVH in here, there's a ton of wind noise, it blows around a lot. It's not the most quiet driving experience. Of course, it's way more quiet and refined than the previous Soul, but when you do it back to back with the other cars, because this is such a breadbox, there's so much glass in here, great for visibility. It's one of the best vehicles to see out of, but you definitely notice more noise. The engine rattles more, just all the little details that you kind of get annoyed with over time would be fine if you're paying $20,000 for a base or $22,000 for a base, but not when you're paying this much. Ride quality in terms of suspension damping, it's way better than it used to be. Again, it's so much more comfortable, it's so much more refined, except in the back seat. Now, we talked about this in the shop. Torsion beam, what does that mean? Well, these types of cars don't particularly need independent rear suspension. The cost to do it can be about as much as $400 per unit from a manufacturing cost, and most of the customers that are trying to save money would rather have that $400 in manufacturing spent on infotainment, sound system. So they've cut it out of here as a budget car, and you don't really notice it in the front. Handling surprisingly good. When you nail it through turns, until you get on the throttle, you don't notice the car losing grip. It's really well balanced for what it is. But the back end, when you're sitting in the back seats, it feels like you're bolted to the suspension. And I had a baby in the back in a car seat, and I was just watching his head as he was sleeping, and it was doing this. Bouncing, bouncing, bouncing. And I felt, you know, obviously you're more controlled as an adult. You can smooth out those motions, but you notice the same thing. You're upset by every single thing in the back seat. And that's something, you know, a lot of people don't talk about. It's one of the things, if you have a lot of people in the back seat or you're going to drive this a lot, get in the back, feel what it feels like, and just make sure that it's okay for what you're trying to get. Start stop. The start stop is hyperactive in this car, and you know, you have to turn it off every single time you get behind the wheel. And it's something, and namely in a rural area, it's starting, stopping, starting, stopping. So it's definitely more annoying, and there's a lot more delay to get this going. If you can get one of the lower spec models for around 22, 21, you're going to be very happy with this. As I talked about with the interior part, the amount of space that's in here is excellent. It's one of my favorite things about it. You have so much room to grow. And I think now is a good time to get into the final thoughts. Final thoughts on the Kia Soul. Pretty much everything that needs to be said has been said about this. If you go to the lower trims, you get a lot better value. If you want some of the tech like wireless charging, the bigger infotainment screen, you're paying a lot more for that privilege. As you go up the chain and you go to the higher end motors and transmissions, while it's a good drivetrain, it's just not particularly good enough in this car. It's just kind of slapped in, and you're paying a lot of money for something you're not going to fully utilize. The audio system, another thing. On paper, And when you play it loud, it sounds decent, but when you're using it at normal volumes, it's just not that great. So a lot of these higher end features they're packing in here, and this is unlike Kia, aren't particularly the greatest value. Now, if you're not picky and you want all that stuff and you have extra money to blow, okay. But I think this is best bought somewhere in the lower to middle trim level, probably used too, because you're gonna save a lot of money. But the good things are this. It's definitely one of the biggest in terms of interior cargo capacity of any product in its class. It has a unique character, and I talked about this in the launch video. It has this unique shape that doesn't exist anymore. It has that, kind of that bread box look. It has better visibility. It's comfortable. It's got a ton of headroom in the front. If you're a bigger person, you're gonna fit. And it's way more refined than the previous generation Soul. So it kind of finds its way in the middle of everything. And the big boost is ride quality, character, and overall configurability of the interior space. So hopefully that helps you if you're shopping for something like this. I'll see you next time.
I'll show him. I'll get ripped and punch him right in his fucking teeth. Then he'll learn. Please help me. Unsubscribe, unfriend him. Please help.